guys, welcome back. Beyond the Blueprint has returned. It's been a while. It's been over a month since our last one of these, but as we move into Madden 19, which is now less than a month away, we're going to continue to hit on things from that original CFM post that I'd like to see make it into CFM. And today we're going to be talking about 90-man rosters, and this is again going to be one of those things that you hear me talk about a lot, in that this is something that I would consider a foundational franchise feature. And what I mean by that is that if you're building an NFL franchise mode from the ground up, let's say you're 2K or any other company and you manage to grab the NFL license and you're building the franchise mode, this should be one of those things that is on that initial list of building blocks. This isn't something like player morale or XP where you're basically creating a mechanic to help enhance the experience. This is a set in stone rule in the mode that is meant to replicate that experience of controlling an NFL franchise and going through the NFL season. And when you're doing that, those rules and authentic elements should really be standard in my opinion. But for those of you that don't know, the roster limit for NFL teams is 90 players during the offseason, and that carries on through the preseason, where they then cut down to the 53-man roster and the 10-man practice squad. Now, this is one of those things that Madden did back in 2011 when they expanded the roster from that classic 53 or 55-man limit that we'd always been used to that 75-man limit that we're now accustomed to. And that was done to align more with the real NFL, which had expanded at 80 at the time. And then the very next year, the NFL ended up pushing that limit up to the 90 players that it's currently at. But unfortunately, we haven't seen CFM follow suit quite yet. But when that was added, it was probably something that was smaller or insignificant for a lot of people, but it was something that was huge for me in particular, which is why I'd love to see them continue to push that to the 90-man limit, not only for authenticity's sake, but also because of what it can add to the roster management dynamic. So that's just kind of on a fundamental level, but from a mechanical standpoint, this is another one of those features that shares a couple of traits that you constantly hear me mention in these type of videos, with one being that this is one of those set and forget type features. We saw it with Madden 12 where rosters were bumped up to 75, and it's been that way ever since, and it doesn't need to really ever be touched except in cases like this where it would be to adapt and update it with the current NFL. But outside of that, it's not really a mechanic as much as it's, like I mentioned, a foundation feature. It's not going to need tuning like XP or sim stats or injuries or anything like that would. You get it in, CFM is now immediately deeper and better because of it, and more or less that's that. The only time you have to come back to it is if the NFL updates its rules, which with something like this is going to be far from a common occurrence. And realistically, I doubt at this point that that limit is going to get any higher than 90. But the second trait is the more important of the traits, and that's its ability to work with other features and the mode itself to make CFM as a whole a better and more in-depth experience. In itself, 90-man rosters is very innocuous, but it works well with other features that are not only currently in the game, but that could be coming to CFM down the line. For example, one of the reasons I wish progression predominantly occurred during the off-season is to create scenarios where, let's say you draft a corner in the later rounds, and then instead of maybe only having one or two corners to compete with him for that final corner spot, with the 90-man roster, you're now going to be able to maybe bump that up to 4 or 5, and then all of those players could potentially have different dev traits and be different scheme fits. Maybe one is a scheme fit but is only normal dev, while another is a quick dev but isn't a scheme fit, and all of those guys might be progressing and accruing XP or skill points at different rates. So it creates those position battles, which is something that you can kind of currently get. But what I'm getting at is that with 90-man rosters, you're going to get that dynamic more often and at more positions than you will with the roster limit at 75. And creating those interesting and sometimes tough decisions is something that takes that period from the draft to the start of the regular season from being something that is just normally auto skipped into something that can actually be an interesting experience. And then now with something like custom draft classes entering the mix, where you have the potential to create 450 guys, there's going to be 226 guys hitting free agency after the draft, and that's a lot of opportunity to find a potential gem or more guys that can compete for roster spots, whether it be the 53-man or the practice squad, that we don't currently have the opportunity for because those roster spots aren't available. Then you look at a situation like that where you have an OTA or a training camp system involved, as well as coaching staffs, and that simple dynamic of adding in 90-man rosters can now be enhanced to an extremely deep level, and features that can work together and pair so well with other features over time are extremely valuable, and regardless of their immediate impact, are more than worth the time it takes to implement. You go back to Madden 12, and one of the things Josh Lumen said regarding the expanded rosters was that it makes the preseason worth playing. But again, if Madden currently is any indication, 75-man or even 90-man rosters by themselves aren't going to make the preseason worth playing. But when you do something like what Madden 12 did, and on top of that you add in the obscured rating system for preseason where you had to evaluate rookies to find out their exact attributes, that was one of my favorite franchise features ever, and that was a great addition to help make those expanded rosters a more impactful feature. If there ever comes a time where something like playbook knowledge or playbook familiarity becomes a thing where players that have been in or know your system are more valuable than bringing in any random player off the street, then again, 90-man rosters can have a huge impact for something like that. And then you throw in a more in-depth injury system or a wear and tear system that plays into both of those, and what you're doing there is, again, you're building layers and layers of depth among features where they're all kind of intertwined, they're all kind of connected, and they're working together. And I've said this before, but when you're able to do that, it can help CFM improve at a much more rapid pace than if you're just adding one-off type features that don't really work well with others. Outside of that though, this would allow for rosters to be more accurate at launch. Every year with only having that 75-man limit, that's going to leave 15 guys per team off the roster, and in a lot of cases completely off the game entirely, even though they're signed to actual rosters. And while most of those guys might not make the final 53, there's definitely a lot of them that end up making the practice squad. And what happens there is that if you want close to authentic rosters as possible to start your CFM, you basically have to wait for that first roster update where a lot of those guys that end up making those practice squads or even making the roster end up being added to the game because they're not in it at launch. Overall though, I think the best way to handle this would be to make it an option within league settings, similar to what you see done with other sports games when it comes to something like schedule length, where instead of playing 82 games or 162 games, you can play a shorter season. So basically you'd have the option of setting the off-season roster limits to something like 53, 75, or 90, so that if you're someone who wants that quicker, simpler experience and you don't want to be bogged down by micromanaging 90 roster spots, you can either stick to what's been the norm for the last several years or even cut it down to the absolute limit and work with that. I don't ever want to box out the casual user, but as I always say, it's a lot easier to take something deep and simplify that than it is to take something simple or shallow and make that deep. But I think that's going to do it though. These are going to pick up more once we get into Madden 19, but until then there might be one or two more of these. I haven't really decided yet, but for now, until Madden 19 drops, it's mostly just going to be that Chiefs CFM. I'm also going to have a new series along similar lines to this one that will also be covering some things that I'd like to see make their way into CFM, albeit in a kind of a different way. So stay tuned for that. Let me know if you guys would also like to see 90-man rosters and your thoughts on it being in CFM, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and until next time, thanks for watching.